Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this class webinar on democratizing South Africa's food system in and beyond the crisis. My name is Ruth Hall. I'm from PLAS. PLAS is the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarians at the University of the Cape. And since lockdown, we have started this webinar series. This is in fact the 6th of our webinars. And today we are joined by key activists across different parts of South Africa's food system who will be talking to us about the impacts of the lockdown and their responses to it. Before we start, I just want to mention a few things. Firstly, you can, in the right-hand side of your screen, see that there is a space for you to comment and to raise questions. So please do use that. When we get to question time, we will select from among those questions and give as much opportunity as we can to our speakers to respond to your questions. Also, after this webinar, the full webinar will be made available on YouTube so that it can be shared more widely. I also want to mention that that all of us, PLAS and the speakers joining us here today, are part of a national platform within South Africa, the C19 People's Coalition, which is a coalition of more than 300 organizations that have come together from across civil society, social movements, and research institutes to push for a just response to the COVID pandemic. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We're very happy to be joined by key people who are challenging the lockdown and also looking at the ways in which the crisis is exposing the long-term chronic crisis in the food system and thinking about how we move beyond this crisis and use the moment of the pandemic to push for more systemic change in the food system. So with that, I'd like to introduce our three speakers. We are joined by Mervyn, who is with the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group in KwaZulu-Natal and runs a very significant program of monitoring food prices and food baskets among women on a regular basis and understanding who's buying what, where, and at what price, a very important insight into food systems. Secondly, we will be joined by Reinette Heunis of the Mawubuye Land Rights Forum, who is based in the Western Cape in Suurbraak, a group of small-scale farmers organizing and mobilizing to support one another, to access inputs and markets, and to craft the strongest space for small-scale farmers within our food system. And we'll be hearing from her. And then thirdly, we will have Greenberg, who is with the African Center for Biodiversity. And AC Bio has been very active in the People's Coalition and is organizing around connecting small-scale farmers with new markets, even in the midst of crisis. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. We have only 1 hour. And the aim of this webinar is actually very ambitious. On the one hand, to describe and understand some of the key features of the hunger crisis that is affecting South Africa. By mid-April, an estimated 20 million South Africans were facing hunger. Over 5 million households had lost jobs in the informal sector as a result of the lockdown regulations. We know that in total, the fund and all government efforts combined have a maximum of 750,000 households with food parcels and on a regular basis. So the dimensions of the hunger crisis are massive, and this in a country where already 1 in 4 children were stunted from malnutrition. So on the one hand, we're dealing with a new crisis, but also a long-standing existing crisis. So perhaps we can kick off with you, Mervyn, if you can take us through what has the Pietermaritzburg group been finding? What can you tell us about what is happening in terms of people's access to food, what people are buying, have buying patterns shifted, and what is happening with food prices according to your research?
So good afternoon, Ruth and other panelists and all those who are viewing, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this webinar. I think it's important, as you had mentioned already, Ruth, that the crisis of hunger in South Africa is not directly connected or is not the result purely of this pandemic, but it has been with us and it's a feature of South Africa's untransformed economy. And but what this pandemic has done is it has thrown a light on that reality of hunger for millions of South Africans. So what we have seen over the last 2 months and the time of the lockdown is, number one, that significant increase in food prices during this period. We have seen, we at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity, we track a basket of 38 basic foods that women in low-income households tell us they prefer to buy on a monthly basis. Now, those 38 foods increased by 7.8%, or in rand value, 249 rand in a period of 2 months. Examples of these increases are rice increased by 26%, sugar beans increased by 18%. We saw cooking oil increasing by 11%, brown bread by 14%, and then a massive increase across the fresh produce and particularly vegetables. So for instance, potatoes by 8%, cabbage by 22%, and carrots by 22%. So what has this in fact meant for ordinary people? Firstly, to say that this increase has taken the cost of our basket now to 3,470 rand. Now that is almost the total amount that workers will take home who are on a national minimum wage. And it's also quite interesting to see that this increase of 249 rand is almost exactly the increase that was granted on the old age pension during this coronavirus period. So in a sense, that increase on the old age pension has already been absorbed by the increases in the price of food. The second thing that we are seeing on the ground is that with the lockdown, with the children being home, with more adults being home, women are now telling us that they are purchasing more food. And that while before the pandemic, their food basket or their food budget might have carried them through for about 3 weeks, the last week of the month being a very difficult week for most low-income households, the food now lasts for about 2 weeks in households. And so women have to purchase more food. And so the type of food that they are purchasing more of are, for instance, maize meal, rice, flour, cooking oil, potatoes, and cabbage. And what they are telling us is that from this additional food they need to purchase comes to a value of around 618 rand. So essentially, what we are saying is that if a household has anything less than an income of 4,000 rand per month, they will starve going into the 3rd week of the month. Furthermore, women are telling us that one of the consequences of the lockdown regulations, particularly around social distancing and around public transport, is that they are spending so much time, in fact hours, outside stores. When they do get inside the supermarket, they have an extremely limited time before they will catch the taxi to get back home. What this in fact means is that the buying patterns have changed. Previously, women would go from store to store looking for the specials or the cheapest possible produce that they need. Now, essentially, they are price takers. They have to go into one store and they have to purchase whatever they need, no matter the price. And of course, if it is more than the budget allows, then certain items fall out of the basket. And generally, the items that fall out of the basket are fresh produce, vegetables, all those nutrient-rich parts of the diet. And so that raises questions around health and our immune system and our ability to withstand the virus should we get infected. The next issue I would like to highlight is, being a health pandemic, households are now spending more money on jik, on green bar soaps, etc. And what that is doing, it is competing with the amount of food that people can purchase. So we are not surprised to see a deepening sense of hunger. We are not surprised to see very long queues of people queuing in the daylight sun in order to get food parcels. Because the reality is that food has just become unaffordable, people being at home, not enough income, the social grants has been too low to help households to absorb these increases in prices. And so households are now suffering and are in hunger much more than they have been in the past. So what can we do about this? I think it's interesting that from this 249 Rand increase, about 100 Rand of that increase happened in the period of the 2nd of March to the 22nd of March. Why is that significant? The 22nd of March, DTI came out with their regulations around control of prices. And then we saw a stabilizing of some of the foods. We believe regulation in a corporate sector system helps. So one of the things that can really help is for DTI to extend their list of regulations on food and include foods such as sugar beans, which is important for nutrition, bread, and fresh produce. The second thing we think could be of greater help is that, of course, we have to look at how do we get food to people immediately. And of course, food parcels in the immediate crisis solution is a solution, but it is only a solution if we do not have red tape and we do not over-regulate the distribution of food. And secondly, that food is distributed to household at least twice a month, because food generally would last for 2 weeks. Really, we believe that the final or the systemic solution really has to do with transforming our food system and creating more local nodes to a more localized food system that is built on the informal food system. Because when the informal traders disappeared off the streets of South Africa, households in low-income households, in fact, suffered hunger at greater proportions than previously. So the informal sector does help, but what we are seeing currently is hunger increasing in low-income households. At the same time, informal food system are not able to connect with those households. So, I mean, I would leave it there, and perhaps we can take up in further question time.
Thanks so much, Mervyn. So I think that what you painted is, on the one hand, we've got this combination of people losing incomes, particularly from informal sector employment and self-employment. At the same time, that the informal food sector has been closed down, taking away people's options of where to get food. And at the same time, we're seeing rising prices in the corporate sector. fact, small-scale farmers are being locked out of existing value chains. So the long-term problems of of small-scale farmers within this food system are being exacerbated. So I think that this also raises important questions, because we're often told that a large-scale, corporate-dominated commercial farming and food system is going to feed our country, is going to deliver cheap food to the country. Yet it seems that small-scale farmers are also experiencing crisis at this time. Can you sketch out for us what's happening in your area? How are small-scale farmers affected by the lockdown, and how are you responding? Sorry,
what we are...
Reinette, can you hear me? And are you able to reply? Over to you, Reinette.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And yeah, I'm been unmuted. I was muted. So yeah, thank you, Ruth, for the opportunity. And I'm Reinette, like Ruth has said. I'm working with an organization called Mawubuye, and we are a land rights movement. But we are not only working in Suurbraak, we are also working in 4 municipalities where we are working with small-scale farmers, food gardens, and so we are basically working with a various group of rural communities. So that Mawubuye is based in the rural areas in the Western Cape. So we are challenging currently since the lockdown. It was a challenge for small-scale farmers, for food producers, as I'm also a food producer in the Western Cape on a not on a small on a commercial scale, but on a large scale. So what the challenge, the first thing the challenge is small scale farmers. The first thing that was happening, access to go to your livestock on a daily basis. People have been prohibited. There's not a permit that was distributed to small scale farmers so that they can access to go and look after the livestock. So Mawubuye have been able to sort out the permits for livestock farmers, but also for small scale farmers that is in the producing food. So yeah, it's been a struggle since the lockdown, and we have not been able to reach out to all our members as Mawubuye. So we have to create a space where we talk daily with our small scale farmers, with our members, as we were normally visiting. We are field workers, so we visit our areas on a daily basis to see what is the challenges that small scale farmers is facing. So that is for us, since the lockdown started, it's very difficult for us to move around. But with the permits, the small scale farmers have been able to move around, to go to the livestock, to check on their fresh produce. But access to the market, access to sell their produce was very limited to them, because they now sell their produce, as people were not able to move around, and many people will go to the shops to buy the produce. And so there was a lot of technical things that we need as Mawubuye to work with our small scale farmers to assist them to get access to a permit, to get access so that they can sell their produce, but also to sell the produce at a very cheap price that we normally sell our produce. So it was difficult for us to for our produce to, because we are practicing agroecology, we are empowering our rural communities about food sovereignty, and so the methodology that we are using is IE, and we are practicing IE on a daily basis. So it was difficult for for food producers to sell the produce at the price that we get. So yeah, it was really for small-scale farmers, where I'm part of small-scale farmers, it was really difficult for us to be able to sell our produce during the start of the lockdown. And we are, like I said earlier, we are working in 4 municipalities. So we are working with various small-scale farmers, and the small-scale farmers is producing from crop production to livestock. So it is really, and some of the small-scale farmers have now been forced because they weren't able to move their cattle around. They weren't able to look after their piggery. So some of them are forced to livestock at a very cheap price as they normally get. So yeah, it's very difficult for small scale farmers to during the period. Before it was also a little bit t- before the lockdown, some of the small scale farmers were also struggling, but now with the lockdown, it's also been becoming very difficult. And also, access to land for small scale farmers is still one of the biggest challenges that we are facing, as some of the livestock farmers don't have access to land. So, yeah, I think that will be my wrap up for now. So, yes, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Reinette. It's so important to hear about this experience. And I think that within the People's Coalition, we've been hearing also about the ways in which the terms of the lockdown are constraining small-scale farmers. A few weeks ago, in fact, on this webinar, we had small-scale fishers who were telling very much a similar story, that while the corporate sector was protected and defined as an essential service, in many ways, the kinds of activities, livelihood activities for small-scale producers were being locked down. So again, we come back to this contradiction of a need to actually strengthen regulation of the corporate sector. And I heard Mervyn's suggestion about expanding the range of price controls to further food items in the supermarkets, and at the same time opening up the informal sector, what some people call opening up the commons, so small-scale farmers, fishers, and informal traders can produce and trade safely. I think those are some of the challenges. So thank you for sharing that. Perhaps, Stephen, we can ask you to come in here and, in a sense, give us your diagnosis of what does this tell us about our food system in South Africa? Because in many ways, we're hearing a story that we've always known, which is that small-scale farmers, despite being the majority of producers in this country, are very marginalized. They have poor access to market. But now in a moment of crisis when consumers are paying more, they are not benefiting. They are cut out. And so there are weaknesses within our corporate food system that are aggravated and exposed at this time. Perhaps you can talk us through why are we seeing this, and what are the broad outlines for an alternative food system?
Okay, thank you, Ruth, and thanks, Plas, for organizing this meeting. I think first things first, we really should deal with the elephant in the room, which is about a market-based food system. So you have a situation where only those who can afford to buy food get access to food. And I think that this crisis has really, as Mervyn and other people have said, has exposed the serious and ongoing hunger and food insecurity in our country. I mean, it's really quite shocking that at this time of serious crisis, organizations have to be scrounging around to find bits and pieces of resources to buy food at market prices to distribute as food relief. I mean, it's unbelievable that we can be in this kind of situation. There are some government programs and charity work on food relief which existed prior to this crisis as well, but they don't meet the needs that fall outside the market. So I think that if the crisis shows one thing, it's that we have to integrate these needs that are outside the market into a more structured and integrated food system. We need a different relationship and understanding of food, that food isn't about a commodity, but it's a necessity. So, I mean, we keep on lauding our right to food in the Constitution. It's 25 years later, that right isn't a reality for anybody. I just want to touch on a couple of issues. I mean, I think the issue of food price rises that Mervyn has spoken to do really reveal a number of very stark inequities in the system and also fragilities. The first one is the structure of the market. Okay, so you have kind of like an hourglass figure. On one end, you have many producers that are mostly weakly organized, especially if you include smallholder farmers. They may be organized at a very local level, but at a national level, they don't have strong organization. So you've got hundreds of thousands, even into the millions of producers here. At the other end of the hourglass, you have millions of consumers who are also very weakly organized. fragmented and isolated and individualized. In the middle of the hourglass, you have a few very large food manufacturers and retailers who basically can control both the many producers and the many consumers, and can control the market essentially. And that is what we're seeing happening. So I mean, when Mervyn was talking about prior to regulations being put in on food controls, you saw prices rising. It's basically profiteering, and they've got the power to do that. So I think that the second thing is also about the structure of the market, which is that the formal sector has got two main channels. The one is to kind of institutional or food service, and then the other one is to the retailers. On the food service, it's kind of like production, which is directed to catering, restaurants, all of that. Now that supply line was shut down in the lockdown, okay? And that means that you have this very strange situation where producers of food don't have a market anymore, but the structure of the market is such that they cannot switch quickly to the retail market. So at the same time, you're having the consumers increasing their demand through the retail channels, because now they're at home, they're not going out to eat prep foods, whether that's at taxi ranks or at restaurants or whatever, street food, anywhere. That's been closed down. People are buying more food to cook at home. So that channel can't meet that demand. And so you have a rise in prices on the consumer side, while you've got on the producer side a drop in prices because people can't find markets. So you've got a broken system in the middle here. There's a disconnection. So I think the other thing also that Mervyn mentioned, for example, was about rice and the massive increase in rice prices. Now we're in a situation where our trade regime for a long time under the WTO has been around minimum market access, which has essentially denuded our production capacity in this country, not for any other reason than that some agreement was made at the in favor of US, European, and Japanese producers to structure the market in a certain way. We're bearing the consequences of that right now. And then when you see the rand tanking, you see the increase in the value, the increase in the cost of imported things, but we're locked into a system where imports are kind of required as part of the trade regime. So you see food prices rising like that. Okay, so these are some of the issues. I mean, of course, there's many others, but we have limited time. What can we do about this? I think that the first thing that this all shows us is that the resolution is about shorter supply chains and more direct connections between producers and consumers, and democratization in the system, which allows more active involvement of local players in these systems. So in Gauteng, with the C19, we have been trying to identify small-scale farmers, small enterprise distributors, and organized communities who can identify where the food needs are and can assist with the process of distributing that last mile. So this is a kind of a potential model that we can start thinking about, much more localized food systems, more controlled by local actors, and more localized. There's some very practical work that's happened and that people could do, even us as almost as individuals or with our neighbors, that we could do. The community action networks is a model that started in Cape Town and it's spread through a number of provinces in the country. This is about local organization with your neighbors to identify food needs, to mobilize resources in your locality, and to organize distribution to those in need. This is a solidarity-based economy. This is something which really has potential to go beyond, especially since this network has started expanding in these times. Then linked to this, connecting small farmers and producers into these networks, so that as neighborhood networks, we could connect directly to small farmers and say, what produce do you have? We buy. You could have buyer collectives or co-ops that can purchase in bulk, distribute locally. So that's one opportunity. Looking at a model of organized producers, organized consumers, and direct links and engagements between them. Okay. There's other things, food gardens, local food gardens that we do homestead and collectively in networks. Starting to produce at least some fresh produce in our localities and distributing and sharing that. Local food production from a processing or manufacturing point of view, prepared food. Why can't people do some production of soup, surplus soup production or other kinds of prepared meals and have some sort of network of distributing that food in a very local way? There's lots of cottage industries that could grow. I mean, we used to have bakeries all over the place. We used to have small green grocers, all of that. All of that's gone now. Everything's centralized by corporates. That's not a necessary model by any means. Okay, so I'm thinking about things like processed goods from fresh produce, small bakeries, and the bonus is also on improved nutritional quality. I'm going to wrap up now. I think just on the points of advocacy, we could talk about municipal open air fresh produce and food markets closer to where people live. Strategic funds for are involved in all food production and distribution. So these are some demands that we should be, or not necessarily demands, but things that we could put to, we could even work in partnerships through.
Okay. Thanks so much, Stephen. So here we've had a storyline about how a corporate-dominated food system producing adequate food at a national level is failing to feed people, and how food price rise in supermarkets are not reflected in benefits for the majority of farmers who are small-scale farmers. And what Stephen's, I think, very vivid image is of an hourglass or an egg timer with a large number of producers, large number of consumers, but a highly concentrated food system that disconnects us. And he's asking for us to think through ways of reconnecting as producers and consumers. And I think that that's very much where Mervyn and Reinette's experience comes in. Maybe, Reinette, I can ask you to come back in here. Mawubuye, as an organization, has been working on food distribution in your area. Now, perhaps you can explain to us what you're trying to achieve in terms of this food distribution and how you strategically see connecting small-scale farmers with people who are needing food as part of a longer-term strategy. Perhaps you can tell us a bit more about that.
Okay. Thank you, Ruth, for the question. And yeah, I think for the past month, during the lockdown period, we as Mawubuye, working with TCOE and Inyanda, the National Land Movement, so we have been able to support plus minus 200 families in the rural communities. But the main thing that we have been able to do is we have been able to support or to buy the small-scale farmers' produce, because, like I said earlier, there's a lack of they couldn't sell their produce as the market the market wasn't accessible, and people couldn't buy their produce. So we have been able, as my purchase the small-scale farmers' produce, so that we can use that to be part of the food parcel that we have been distributed. And like it's not the same parcel that the government have provided, as we have been able to provide produce that is from the farmer directly to the communities. And what we've also included in our food parcels is seed, because we all have Mervyn have speak earlier about the increasing of food prices, and I think that is why we have been able to, in each food parcel, we have put 3 varieties of seeds that people can plant, because people are not going to be able, I think in the next 2 months' time, people won't be able to buy any produce in the shop because it will be expensive, and they will still exploit the poor people. And I think so for us, it was really, we put the food, the fresh produce, the seeds into the food parcel, so that we can assure that people will be able to plant their own veggies, so that they can stay away from the supermarket. So they won't be able to buy them from the supermarket. That is, the price is very high. So that is what is our role in the rural communities, into the different areas that we are working, is to assist and to help and to promote small-scale farmers to plant, and also for backyard gardens, because some people don't have access to big plots, but we are also assisting these small-scale food gardeners, that they can plant back at home and use alternative models of planting, so that we can ensure that people don't go hunger to bed, because that is the current stats in South Africa, that a lot of people go to bed without. So we are, as an organization, we are trying to assist small-scale farmers to have access to seeds and to have access to buying their fresh produce to distribute in the communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reinette. So we've now got quite a lot of action in our live comments stream, and we have among those a question from Lesego, which I think we're going to share on the screen. Why have lawmakers not forced commercial farmers to meet domestic need before exports are allowed? So we have a question here around really, should we be looking at strengthening regulation, including export bans or certain restrictions on exports in the context of needing to address local needs? This brings to mind also an article that came out in the first week of lockdown, at the same time that we as PLAS were warning that this pandemic would be a hunger crisis. One of the leading agricultural economists in South Africa published a paper arguing that food security in South Africa is intact. Corporate supply lines will feed the nation. And I think that there we see this fundamental contradiction of two different paradigms, one which sees a free market approach and production, commercial production as assuring food security, and the other which is pointing to the fact that there's massive food insecurity at local level. So maybe Mervyn or Stephen, do you want to come back into responding to Lesego's question around, in a sense, political power and commercial farming and other corporate interests in our food system, and how they influence policymaking?
So, Ruth, I think, for me, the first response would be exactly what Stephen had said. And the tension really is around what we consider food to be. And so from our perspective and a social justice perspective, food is not a commodity. It's part of the right to life. And of course, in a market system, food is just merely a commodity that we can trade as best we can in order to make as best a profit as we can. So I think it is a question around power. It's a question around how do we consider, or what do we consider food to be? And how do we organize political power around that? And also the other reality is that, we can limit, and perhaps we should limit food for internally, but perhaps before we do that, can we ensure that the informal smallholder farmer can get their produce to consumers who need it? Because if we're only going to focus on external commercialization, we might be back to square one. I would rather us trying to make sure that the informal sector is able to get the food that they have to starving people in the townships.
Okay, thank you so much, Mervyn. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add on that. So the question from Lesego was around why have lawmakers not addressed the issue of exports, and are commercial farmers lobbying them? But I think that also there's another question from Paula Mpuna, which is an important one, around what can we learn from other countries? So she's asking, do we have data on how countries where small farmers predominate and access markets have less issues of food pricing, accessibility, and hunger? So are there models and examples from elsewhere that we can draw inspiration from?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing because Africa actually, the majority of Africa, it's small-scale producers who produce all the food. I mean, I think Mark Wegerhof and others have done work on local systems. It's on small-scale farmers. I mean, this is the norm in Africa. In fact, we're the odd ones out here with this overly concentrated, overly centralized system that does expose certain fragilities. I mean, it's all fine to talk about, yeah, the food supply is assured for now. But what happens if this continues for a little bit longer? Some of the commercial farmers can't find markets for their goods. That one affects upstream and downstream, which implicates a lot of small organizations that depend on these commercial farmers finding their markets and making sure that those markets are delivered to. And I think that we're seeing that in other countries already. In the US, where the meat packers were closed for a little while, it had a major knock-on effect upstream to farmers who basically now had thousands of pigs that they couldn't sell anywhere. They had to slaughter all those pigs. You have like literally slaughter, and then those people go out of business or they struggle, they can't find other markets because they're locked into certain contracts. So I don't think that this is the end of the story just because the previous harvest from this last summer season is available, that means that that's going to continue in the future. I think we need to prepare ourselves. We need to be ready for more localized systems where people can produce and distribute very locally.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So, Stephen, you're, in a sense, starting to map out some of the elements of a more resilient food system. Yesterday, I was on a webinar with the Centre of Excellence in Food Security, looking at how to build a more resilient food system in Cape Town. And what was striking there was this notion of, in fact, we shouldn't treat this pandemic as a standalone event. We are in a wave of crises, climate crisis, financial crisis, crises in global markets, and a lot of the positions around building a more equitable food system are also about building a more resilient one for the next waves of crises that will be hitting us. Perhaps I can come back to you, Reinette. There's a question in the comments which is specifically about the issue of small-scale farmers. Rafilwe Joala is asking, would it be viable to introduce procurement regulations for NGOs distributing food parcels to procure from small producers and processors? So I'd be interested to hear from you. In your area, is government or the Solidarity Fund, are they procuring, are they engaging with small-scale farmers? Would you be open to that? And I'd also like to hear from Stephen. Perhaps you can tell us from the Gauteng side. I know there's been an initiative to try and link up small-scale farmers who have lost their markets at this time with food relief efforts. This in a context where unless specific actions are taken, food relief will have the effect of, in fact, entrenching corporate control within the food system. So perhaps, Reinette, you can comment on the food parcel practices in your area, and Stephen, the alternatives that you're trying to craft in Gauteng. Reinette?
Okay. So, Ruth, to the question that have been asked by the viewer, is we are working with the NGO TCOE, and so we have been able to distribute the food parcels to the communities, and there's not any support from government, even from local government, from national or from the Solidarity Fund. There's no support from them. It's been funds that have been raised through our NGO, and we are trying to support as much families as we can in the rural community. So we would like to work hand in hand with the Solidarity Fund and to purchase from the small scale farmers. So I think for time being, there's not been any corrective working from the government towards the local NGO with the local CBOs in our area that we are working. So there's not been really interaction from government side to see how they can support the small scale farmers in the different areas to buy their produce to be part of the food parcel that they have been distributed. So we as the Mawubuye group, we have been able with TCOE, we have been able to support the small scale farmers to buy the produce so that it can be part of the food pack that we are distributing to the communities. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Stephen, would you also like to come in terms of this question of, in the midst of relief efforts, to be procuring from small-scale farmers rather than buying only through corporate value chains?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that one of the issues also there is about the nutritional benefit of purchasing fresh produce. These goods, it's non-perishables. Of course, there's an understanding that it's difficult to manage the fresh produce supply lines. It's a bit more difficult because you need cold chains and storage systems and all of that, but still it can be done. I mean, I think that our model is very much about connecting small-scale farmers, identifying who those are, also identifying the gaps and the limitations of that and seeing how we can actually start building that up so that when the next one does hit, because certainly we're in an era of crisis now. This is not just a wave, we're in an era of crisis. The climate crisis has started, it's going to come, it's going to get worse, and there'll be other pandemics. I think we have to get used to this as a way of, and we have to start in and engaging much more directly and concretely with people immediately around us. As far as very big other limits like the banks.
Okay, thanks so much, Stephen. We have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to suggest that we start to move towards thinking of some quite concrete proposals. First of all, we have a question from that I think maybe Mervyn might like to comment on, which is a question from Nganyiso Gumede, which is, there are reports of decreasing farm gate prices, but increasing retail prices. So in other words, the rising food prices that you were telling us about earlier, Mervyn, are not necessarily being passed on to farmers, be they commercial farmers or small scale, largely commercial. But instead, this tells us something about that concentrated center in the hourglass that Stephen was referring to. Are you hearing that? I think that there are issues particularly around livestock and meat products, but perhaps you can talk about, are we seeing that the price rises are reflecting rising input costs, or is this price gouging?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So what we are seeing, and of course our view is quite limited up here in KZN, so I can't necessarily say what's happening across the country, but the system in fact is being reinforced. So what this crisis has done, it has reinforced the fragility of the system that we have always known about. So for instance, we have always known that the buying power of certain retail companies. So for instance, a retail company will go to a milk farmer or to a farmer that works with eggs and say, I will purchase all your eggs at 10 cents. And so the farm gate price will be 10 cents, while at the retail level, it is, a rand or 2 rand or sometimes even 3 rand. So this is not new. It's not new to the crisis. We have seen, for instance, that farmers, be it commercial farmers even, have been receiving very little at the gate for their produce. And we have seen increasing prices further down the line. One of the reasons why we think that, for instance, prices should stabilize or come down is because of the petroleum price, which also features in the retail price, has come down significantly over the past 2 months, etc. So there is definitely a situation of price gouging happening. It, of course, is difficult to pinpoint exactly at what particular point, but it is very clear that having 5 main retail stores in South Africa provides too great power concentration to these retail companies. and hence we are seeing what we have seen, but it's not new, it is just deepening what has already been the case.
Great, thanks so much, Mervyn. So we have 2 questions. In fact, it's very active chat. Thanks very much for comments and questions as well. We have 2 comments and questions from Andries du Toit, and I guess this goes to really the question around, you know, there's this popular word at the moment, to pivot. Are we at a pivot point? Is this a moment where we are seeing potentially massive consolidation of corporate control, or a crisis of the corporate system and the emergence of alternatives to it? So how realistic is it to understand the pandemic as being a moment that can bring about positive change? Stephen, you've talked a lot about the potential range of local actions that can be taken, but surely these need to move to scale. And in order to create the space for that to happen, there also needs to be regulation of the corporate sector. Perhaps in response to Andries's question and his comment, his concern that in fact this is leading to deeper marginalization of small farmers, what forms of regulation in of the corporate sector do you think are important to open up the space for these various forms of connecting small-scale producers and consumers to happen?
Yeah, okay, now you're putting me on the spot about regulation of the formal sector. I mean, I think that we need to, the task that's in front of us right now, I think, is to build alternative systems. Honestly speaking, I'm quite tired of the constant critique of the formal sector. We need to do something different. We need to build something different. We need to force at something different. I think that it's predetermined. It depends on what we do now. This is a pivot moment in the sense that it exposes some really huge inequalities. It exposes some weaknesses and fragilities in the formal system, and that is widespread recognition. It's recognized by the society much more widely. I mean, food is like a priority issue in the society right now. That means we can start talking about that, and some of for saying to us, we need to think about different ways of doing things. We recognize that we haven't been supporting local household producers enough, and that they play a crucial role in local food security. Municipalities are saying, why are we getting all of our produce coming from far distances when actually we could be producing it locally? We need to enter into that space, take those gaps and make those changes. It's not guaranteed. We can't sit back and say, does this thing show that the corporates are, is it one or the other? It depends on what we do, really. And I also think that we need to interact locally, build ourselves locally, and from those locals connect together. I don't think that we can talk about scale by you can just impose a thing from a national level across the board. It doesn't happen like that. It has to come from the ground up. I think democratization of the systems, allowing consumers and producers and all the intermediaries to speak to each other in a much more direct way, a much more agent-based way, can really assist us to think of the food system in a different way. So, yeah, that's what I think.
My apologies. Okay, thanks very much, Stephen. So I think that at this point, perhaps we can move towards wrapping up. In the course of the conversation, there have been a lot of very concrete ideas about what comes next. And perhaps we can ask you, Reinette, to lead us in terms of, for you as Mawubuye, what do you think are the next most important things that you will be doing, and what else can you advise others to be doing at this time to help promote an alternative food system?
Part of this panel. I think firstly, as Mawubuye, the Land Rights Organization, working with Inyanda, the National Land Movement, and TCOE, I think our next work that we will be doing is on how we are going to assist, because we all have heard about everyone knows about the relief fund that has been for small-scale farmers, but it was not really accessible to all of our small-scale farmers. And I think So some of them have applied, some could not be applied because there was a certain criteria that have been established for small-scale farmers about your income have to be 20,000, between 20,000 rand and 1 million rand. And some of our small-scale farmers is doing the livelihood from a day-to-day, so they don't have that income that is being trained. So most of our small-scale farmers have been left out. So that is some of the most critical work that we will be doing over the next period of time to see what is our strategy will be that there need to be a next round where our small scale farmers can apply. So there's a process or place where we hope that the minister will set up a second round for small scale farmer to apply for the funding. So I think that is one of our key issues that we are discussing and we are talking through. But I think mainly small scale farmers, and that has been our cry in the past years that is going on, and that we as Mawubuye has been working, is access to land, because it is still a critical topic and a topic that the government don't want to listen to. So that is one of our things that we want to emphasize government is that they need to make sure that everyone, all the small scale farmers in the rural communities, in the urban areas that wants to farm have access to land. So yeah, that will be and I think we need to, this is the time now that all civil societies, all movements, we need to work together and we need to strengthen the voice of the poor, because the voice of the poor have been left out over the years, and we are enough and we are strong to let the voice of the poor people be heard. So yeah, I think that is for me critical, that we need to work collectively. We need to build collectively the voice of the people in South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Reinette. So powerful. And in final comments and thoughts, Mervyn, what's the way forward for the Pietermaritzburg group? How can others engage? How can all of us be part of documenting, responding to, finding alternatives, and support the work that you as Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group are doing, and try to find alternatives at a local level around the country? What's your way forward?
So Ruth, I think there are a few immediate crisis level interventions. And as I've mentioned before, one of the important interventions could be that the DTI regulations around price control and price gouging be extended across a basket of food. I think that's critical, that we can keep the prices affordable at retail level. The second one is, as a matter of urgency, we have to remove the regulations that stops the small-scale farmers from interacting with informal traders on the streets in the township. We have to recognize the importance of that sector to food, and so that we don't have food waste at the same time as we have hunger. So that would be the second thing. And the third area, I would totally agree with Stephen, is we have to force our way at this particular moment of crisis to claim our right to democratize the system. And part of that would be for all of us in the progressive movement to begin to say, how do we strengthen and build power at the local in order to change our perception on what food means for society?
Thanks so much. It's been so striking how the issues around the politics of food have been center stage in this pandemic crisis. That was so evident when last week's webinar on food sovereignty organized by COPAC was actually screened live on SABC. And I thought, wow, this is a moment where actually the concept of food sovereignty that has been organized around, mobilized around for many years is now actually mainstream. Now the actual fundamental assumptions underpinning our food system are being questioned. That is now a very significant shift in narrative. Stephen, what are the next steps, both for activists that you're working with in Gauteng, KZN, and what about the national process? Perhaps you can outline that there is an engagement between civil society organizations, the Solidarity Fund, and the state. But perhaps you can say from both the activist local grassroots level, how small-scale farmers are organizing and what the next steps are.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's not only about farmers, it's about all actors in the food system, which incorporates consumers, intermediaries, traders, producers, distribution agents, input suppliers, all of them. I think we have to take this opportunity that's opened up now to act with creativity and urgency. I think we have to recognize that this crisis, okay, the pandemic has caused people to see a crisis, but we've been living with a crisis for such a long time, a crisis of food insecurity where people are going to bed hungry day after day after day, and we've all just accepted that as a normality, or as this is how our society is. It's not necessary. We can do something different, and we need to take this opportunity to really act. If there's someone without food, we need to make sure that person's got food, end of story, and we need to make that a real mission of ours. I think we need local solutions. There's lots of different initiatives, a lot of energy. We must have those local solutions, and we must network with each other. That's on the scale. Doing your thing and then networking with others to learn and share what we're doing. Government is very open. We've been meeting with the Minister, DG, FAO, and others about these things. They are open to this idea of local food systems. Let's take that opportunity and that space. The Solidarity Fund, I don't have that much. I don't really think they're going to go very far. I think it's a short-term. People want to. I'm not sure that they're necessarily a longer-term solution, but to the extent that they would be interested to work with us, that would be fine. But I think we must have longer-term ways of approaching this. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So we're going to be wrapping up now. I just want to reiterate that this is such an important and evolving conversation that's happening in various places right now. I think that also documenting some of the alternatives that are emerging, finding ways of supporting activists and farmers, and consumer groups around the country is going to be important. Just to say, next week, this class webinar will focus on questions around land rights and access to land, and move beyond the South African context to look at how the pandemic is affecting access to land and land rights among farmers and rural people around different parts of the continent. And in 2 weeks' time, we'll be addressing the issue of buyers' cooperatives, the important role of us as people who buy food in shaping the food system. So that is one way in which we can all play a role in changing this picture. So thank you very much for being part of this webinar today. Thank you for the very lively chat in the comments. We haven't got around to all the questions, but we will note them down and we will be engaging further. Thank you to all of our presenters for very thought-provoking, concerning, but also energizing and inspiring ideas around alternatives that help to give shape to this agenda. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining.